Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Lukas Degutis and this is our weekly omnibus. In case you missed it, this week's issue is on cruel labour. Our editor Michael Gove looks at the moral vacuum at the heart of Starmerism. He writes how the troubles facing the government today stem from the absence of a coherent political philosophy when they were in opposition. Elsewhere in the magazine, Charles Moore says Trump's meddling in British affairs is a taste of our own medicine. Sam Leith argues how ChatGPT is devaluing creativity, while Lawrence Osborne reflects on Myanmar's deadly earthquake as he writes a letter from Thailand's capital, Bangkok. Plus, don't forget to browse our new Spectator shop if you have not. We have caps, mugs, puzzles, notebooks, and much more. You'll find very convenient links below in the description. Now, the week. A criminal court in France found Marine Le Pen guilty of embezzlement, disqualifying her from running for 5 years. But has this made the National Rally leader even stronger? US and Deputy Editor Freddy Gray spoke to John Keiger and Robert Tombs.
I believe that Marine Le Pen was expecting to be found guilty, but was perhaps not expecting to be banned from running. Is that your understanding? And how big a story is this?
That is correct. In fact, they've been playing down, the whole of the Rassemblement National and Madame Le Pen have been playing down what impact this all might have. However, even they were remarkably surprised at the result. And I think that's shown by the fact that Marine Le Pen actually walked out of, while the judge was giving her sentence, she actually walked out before the end, which was seen certainly by the French media as her self-composure dropping, falling apart, and secondly, her annoyance, her rage even that this should have happened.
And John, just sticking with you for one more question, how final is this? I mean, she can appeal and presumably have the decision overturned. Yes,
but the French law on this is a little bit particular in that whilst waiting for appeal, the sentence will be applied. So she will automatically and immediately come under all of these things. Certainly her eligibility is suspended. So she will immediately have to stand down as a local official in the one of the northern departments. She will have to stand down immediately. So will all the other people who are found guilty and who have been given what's called an arrêt provisoire on all of their activities. So it is extremely serious.
Robert, we're seeing this more and more in Western democracies now. Popular figures who may be unpopular with parts of the establishment being pursued by the legal system, and it obviously strikes a lot of people as corrupt and unfair. From your reading, how corrupt and unfair is this case?
Well, I think there's no doubt that she is guilty of what she's charged. Whether that is a sufficient explanation, I'm not sure. But let's say I think many people will doubt it. I think many people would not think that using EU funds for a purpose to which they are not explicitly intended is not much of a crime, as the European Parliament and the EU itself are notoriously lax about the use of funds. And what she did in this case, as we know, is to have people who are on the EU payroll, in a sense, doing other things. Now, I may be cynical, but I suspect that is not an uncommon thing for politicians who are EU members of the EU Parliament to do. So the question would be why now and why her? And therefore, I think whatever you think about the gravity of what she did, I think I would say that it's not just a matter of how serious a corruption or how serious an offence, but how dangerous is this as an act of the French courts. Now, the French courts, the judge and the court may have acted entirely independently. And the French courts have a record of being pretty robust in dealing with delinquent politicians. I sometimes wish ours were a bit more so. But they do put politicians in prison. I don't know when the last British politician to go to prison for a political offence was, which in a sense this is. And I would have said that it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for the law to be seen, or the courts to be seen, as taking an action which has huge political consequences. And it's also possibly counterproductive. I'm sorry, I'm saying what's obvious now, but we saw this with Trump, as you said, and it made Trump probably stronger. I think many of Le Pen's followers, I'd be interested to know if John agrees with this, will see this as an act of the establishment, will see this, and indeed have said this, that it is an anti-democratic act. And I think, the French democracy is at the moment in a pretty fragile state. It seems to me dangerous that this should have happened.
Well, John, do you agree with that? And also, I mean, given that we do normally see we've seen with Trump and with others, a popular reaction against these legal decisions. Will that apply to Marine Le Pen, or will it be a case for Rassemblement National that they will be another figure, for instance, Jordan Bardella, likely seen as her replacement? Will he gain from this, or will Marine just get stronger herself?
It's already beginning to happen that the French public, and certainly politicians that you would never have expected to have sided with Marine Le Pen, are beginning to side with her. So just on the popularity to begin with, ironically, there was a poll that came out day before yesterday in France, which puts Marine Le Pen on 37% for the first round of the presidential elections. So that is a remarkable score. I mean, just to put it in some kind of context, when François Mitterrand and when Sarkozy, who were the most popular presidents that there had been in the previous period, when in the first round they went into the competition for the presidentials, they only got around about 33-34%. So she would be one of the most popular politicians that there has been as president of the French Republic. The second thing is that those people who are beginning to side with her are people like Jean-Luc Mélenchon and members of the extreme left, the center. Now, the government has sent out a tweet today, apparently, telling every member of the government that they must make no comment about this whatsoever, either on social media or in the media in general. So you can see that there's an attempt to control this, which I think is beginning to surprise in its breadth and its depth, even the government in power.
Mm. And of course, the finger of suspicion points inevitably, doesn't it, Robert, towards Emmanuel Macron. Obviously, the legal system is supposed to be separate from the presidency in France. But as with Trump and Biden, Biden, of course, was head of the Department of Justice, but there was supposed to be no involvement from Biden in Trump's persecutions, but everybody suspected that there was. To what extent do French people suspect that Macron is behind this, and what evidence is there that they're right?
Well, I think they certainly will think that. Whether it's true or not, of course we don't know, and we may never know. But the French judiciary is unlike the British judiciary, and the British judiciary have shown themselves able to do some pretty extraordinary things in recent years. If one's thinking about the extension of judges' political interventions. But in France, the judiciary is, in a sense, a politicized body. It's the appointments of judges. It is a profession in a sense. It's part of the civil service, and so promotions and so on are dependent on to some extent on behavior. So one couldn't say that the French judiciary is entirely separated from political considerations. But I don't know, John will know better than I, but I think it's quite possible that this is something that the prosecutors and the judges themselves are very eager to do, as being part of a generally fairly liberal establishment, and who are certainly not averse to taking the opportunity to put a spoke in the wheels of a movement which they think is extremely dangerous for France. And of course, they might be right about that. It's none of us knows what would happen if the Rassemblement National ever actually came, or the Ralliement National ever actually came to power. It could mean a huge shock to the whole French system. So one can imagine that many people in positions of authority who are themselves sympathetic towards the centre or the centre left would think that this is a jolly good way of putting a stop to a very dangerous woman and a very dangerous movement. But the thing that worries me as a French citizen as well as a British citizen is that the shock effect on the whole French system will certainly be unpredictable.
Yes, and the French judiciary, I'm afraid, does have form on this. As some of you may remember, or some of the listeners and will remember, in 2013, the media got into one of the trade unions, because French judges are trade unionized, and got into one of their staff rooms where they had a series of photographs on the wall of the Syndicat de la Magistrature of all of the people under what they called the Mur des Cons, which translated rather euphemistically means the wall of bastards. And on that were a number of right-wing politicians and other people of the right, intellectuals and others. And this became widely known. And ever since, the French in general have a rather jaundiced view of the impartiality of their judges. And so that ironically occurred at the same time as this story was beginning to develop in the European Parliament. So there is some concern that the judges are not that impartial. And of course, Monsieur Macron recently appointed a new president of the Constitutional Council, which could in some ways intervene in this whole process towards the end. But this person that he appointed is a total Macroniste of the first hour of 2017. And so one wonders about the impartiality of the system throughout.
Well, Macron has been accused before of trying to bring on a constitutional crisis, possibly even to prolong his time as president. Do you think we are at the beginning of a constitutional crisis here, John, and then Robert?
I think it's a constitutional crisis in the waiting. It's been hanging around for a little while now, ever since, I suppose, the rise of Marine Le Pen, the rise of Le Rassemblement National in the last legislative elections, and the fact that 11 million people voted for her, and she was squeezed out by this parliamentary Republican bloc that formed that impeded her from coming to power. So there is a sense in France that constitutionally things are extremely fragile. And this kind of thing might just push the glass barrier right through and bring on some things which, well, the worst of which, of course, would be some kind of insurrection, but could be just generally an attitude on the part of the people and trade unions and an awful lot of things could block the whole country, let alone the system.
Yes, I agree with that. It's not too long ago that we had the Gilets jaunes coming out to demonstrate and to block roads and so on, and in a very nasty, and even by British standards at least, indeed by French standards, a rather bloody confrontation between ordinary people and the authorities. And the sort of people who supported the Gilets jaunes are the sort of people who support Marine Le Pen and who feel that they are the people who are neglected and ignored by the system. We see this in every country now. People who feel that whatever they want and whatever they say, the people who believe they know best take no notice. And Marine Le Pen's strength was, I think, not so much in her own talents, as it were, or in her oratorical skills or her grip of economics, etc., but simply in the fact that she was the person who seemed to be best able to represent all the people who felt left behind and ignored. In that sense, of course, there is an obvious parallel with Trump and to some extent with Nigel Farage. Though I think in a way people had come to think that Marine Le Pen would be capable of being a reasonable president. Whether she would or not, we don't know. But this attempt to sabotage the whole process, as I said, forgive me for repeating myself, just seems to me to be a very dangerous development.
Looking at what's going to happen with Rassemblement National and the future, Marine Le Pen, let's say she's now out of the picture and there is no successful appeal and she isn't able to run. People point towards Jordan Bardella as the natural and likely successor. Who else is there, John, who might come up? Because, as people have said, Bardella might be a bit of a lightweight on the national stage.
Well, I mean, there is one scenario that you didn't mention that is a possibility for Marine Le Pen. I mean, she will definitely go to appeal, and that appeal won't take place before about a year to a year and a half. But there is another possibility, and that is, irony of ironies, is that Article 17 of the French Constitution allows the President of the Republic to pardon individuals. And there is talk of that at the moment, that Macron, in one of his last gestures, could be seen as the great saver of French democracy, saver from itself in a way, by pardoning Marine Le Pen and allowing her to stand in the presidential elections in 2027. But that's a bit of political fiction for the moment. But the other people that could stand are, for instance, Marine Le Pen's former partner, whose name is Louis Alliot, who is the mayor of Perpignan, where I'm sitting at the moment. And Louis Alliot is seen by many people as a very safe pair of hands, a very solid politician with a southern accent, who is close to the people, who knows how to run rather efficiently here a municipalité. And so he might be a possibility. The second, of course, is a return of Marine Le Pen's niece, who would be Marion Maréchal, who has been off the scene for quite some time because she moved further to the right, or a different kind of right, a sort of more liberal economics right, whereas Marine Le Pen's right is much more central to the people and a kind of, in some people's eyes, a kind of socialism. So Marion Maréchal is a possible returner here. And she's already spoken out today, saying that she is utterly and totally behind her aunt.
And Marion Maréchal has had fallings out with her aunt in the past, I believe, Robert. And she represents, she has represented, I should say, a more economically right-wing conservatism, as John says, but also far more of a Catholic conservatism than perhaps Marine Le Pen, who is very socially liberal after all. Would she mark a change in direction for RN?
Yes, I think she would. She's quite young and quite glamorous and quite an attractive figure in the superficial way that, after all, is not negligible in politics. But she does represent, I would say, one of the strands of French conservatism. There's a classic division of the French right into three strands, one of which is Catholic, one of which is nationalist, and one of which is parliamentary. And I suppose Marine Le Pen represents, in a sense, the nationalist strand. And her niece represents more the Catholic strand, but these are both present and have always been present in the right. And although France is a pretty secularized country, as Britain is, I don't think one can underestimate the influence, certainly a sort of, at least a vestigial influence of Catholicism for many people, especially outside the large cities. And I don't know whether John would think this is significant.
Yes, I mean, I'd add to that that, as you say, France is a fairly secularized country, but there is a resurgence of people attending church, the number of people who want to be curé again, and as a result, really, not so much as belief in God, but identitarian politics, a kind of reaction to the rise of sort of Muslim politics, which are clearly evident everywhere. And you see this and hear about it from a number of people who themselves I've always thought of as being fairly secular, who now have started to attend church on a Sunday.
I suppose, similar to Muslims, Catholics, devout Catholics, tend to have a lot of children and have done for a long time, encouraged by government famille nombreuse policies. And maybe we're just seeing that beginning to express itself at the ballot.
Yes, perhaps you're right. I mean, there is a kind of recognizable kind of person in France. You can immediately say this person is a Catholic, and this person probably has quite a few children. I don't think there's quite the equivalent of that. You might say the sort of home counties Anglican type, but there is a strong cultural Catholicism, as John says, which may not be entirely theologically sound or active, but which does represent a whole set of values and of traditions. And under the stimulus of both, of globalization, of the obvious presence of Islam in France, and a sense that values of the family are being weakened. I think that could be something that's bound to revive. How important it will get, we don't know. But it's as one element of a kind of rejection of the orthodox, liberal, progressive tendency that is happening, after all, in many countries. I think in France, Catholicism would be one aspect of that.
And John, you mentioned that Marion Maréchal went further to the right than Marine for a while and seems to have come back together with her aunt more recently. But somebody she aligned herself with was Eric Zemmour, who at the last presidential election was briefly thought to be a potentially very popular figure. It didn't really materialize. But he regarded Marine as, or still does regard Marine, I think, as too politically correct, wrong on economics, and an insufficiently radical figure for what France needs. Now that Marine has been scuppered, does that open up an opportunity for RN to become this more radical right-wing force that people like Zemmour and perhaps Marion have always wanted it to be?
I think it does open that possibility. And there are all sorts of things that are being discussed as a sort of knee-jerk reaction to this decision, but there are fragilities within the RN itself. There are wings in the RN. I mean, for instance, Jordan Bardella is far more liberal economics than Marine Le Pen. And if say, Zemmour and Marion Maréchal and Jordan Bardella could all get together in that famed idea of a union of the rights, then it could become quite a potent force at the next presidential elections. But even before that, there are all sorts of instabilities now that are beginning to break out. I mean, because there's big talk, of course, immediately that Marine Le Pen might take her revenge by overturning the government, which she is in a position to be able to do in the next week or so. And so you can see all sorts of things breaking out. And then perhaps just a small addition is the French amour-propre, their sort of pride about the reaction that is being provoked overseas. So you've probably seen that the Kremlin has already pronounced on this and said it is a denial of democracy. Viktor Orban has said, "Je suis Marine." And so it's the French look at that and they don't really like that. They feel hurt by it, that their democracy is not seen as a beacon internationally. And those kind of things, I think, impact all the way through. And how this will break out in itself is to be seen in the next month or so.
That's very interesting, Robert. Do you think, is it in the French character to react in support of the system as it exists, as a sort of, dislike of foreigners, telling them that their country is ruined? Or is it likely to be an embarrassment and an attempt to change France from within?
Well, I think the French, like the British, are very inclined to extreme declinism and pessimism, and to say that everything's going wrong and that things are terrible, and that can either lead to a kind of cynical detachment from politics, or it can lead to a rather strong reaction. I don't think one can say in this case, but the emergence all over Europe, of course, and indeed way beyond Europe, of what seems to be a growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the whole liberal and indeed democratic system among young people. And Le Pen's support is quite strong among the young, is something that can't just be, as it were, suppressed. It would be very foolish to say, well, now the Le Pen problem has gone away, and therefore France can get back to normal, because I'm not sure there's a normal to get back to.
And lastly, a question for you both. The fact that there is a European element to this case, so European Union funds, might that lead to a further anger towards the European Union on the populist right in France and the populist left, and a sense that the EU is part of the corrupt establishment that needs to be overturned?
Well, I think this could be an extra point. I mean, at the trial today, there was a representative, a lawyer for the European Union, who was present as a sort of partie civile, talking, and who at the end made a statement. I'm not sure how beneficial that is going to be to those people who are pro-European. But it will be seen as the EU intervening now through the courts in who gets to run as a politician in France. And it could have very, very negative effects for the EU lobby in France, which remains extremely strong, particularly amongst the sort of liberal elite, metropolitan liberal elites, and those people who are upper civil servants, not least those who are in Brussels who are French, but also closely in contact, because they're all in arc themselves, with those civil servants who are in France itself.
Robert, do you agree with that? Because you wrote quite a lot about it to do with Brexit, a sort of suspicion among the people that the European Union and the legal system are in cahoots to suppress their will. Yes,
I mean, I do agree with all that John said on that. France and Britain, or rather, are not unlike each other here. Indeed, if you go back to 2016, the EU was more unpopular in France than it was in Britain. Macron said at the time he thought that if the French had been given a vote, they would have voted to leave. Well, that subsided partly because of the problems that Brexit seemed to be causing in Britain, or was causing in Britain. And I think there was a strong sense that you couldn't actually do much about it. You've got to accept it and make the best of it. But I think that the French, or at least many people in France, again, the sort of people I mentioned earlier, who feel themselves to be left behind and ignored, are not admirers of the EU and don't see the EU as their saviour, but do see the EU as part of this establishment. And I think, as John says, I think people will be pretty annoyed to think that the EU is now, in some senses, taking part in France's judicial system and is taking part in an attack on its most popular politician. Yes, I think it will have a big effect.
A new international airport in Pakistan was on the minds of some Labour MPs this week. Curiously, some of them have openly opposed the expansion of London's own Heathrow Airport on environmental grounds. Our news editor John Connolly spoke to Brendan O'Neill on this fiasco and the wider pro-Pakistan lobby in Westminster.
It's crazy. It's a really one of those mad stories that makes you wonder if April Fools came early this year. It's, 20 MPs in total, mostly Labour MPs, as you say, have written this letter to the Prime Minister of Pakistan saying he must support the building of an airport in Mirpur in Pakistan-ruled Kashmir. And the justification they give is that some of their constituents would find it easier if there was an airport near Mirpur, because currently the closest one is 80 miles away by road, which takes 3 hours, which, by the way, doesn't sound that long to me. That's a pretty normalish length journey from an airport to where you live. And so they say it must have this airport. But what's really striking about this, there's two things. Firstly, why are they focusing on what Pakistan needs rather than what their own British constituents need here in Britain? But also, a lot of these MPs are the kind of MPs who oppose airport construction in Britain, who oppose the third runway at Heathrow because it would be so polluting and disastrous for the planet. And yet they support the building of airports 5,000 miles away. It's really quite staggering.
It's amazing. I think that's what stood out the most is when you've got MPs like Zara Sultana sort of saying, a third runway at Heathrow would be an environmental catastrophe, but here they're lobbying for a new airport completely somewhere else. I mean, it does call into question how important all these sort of environmental things actually are, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You know, a few months ago, Zara Sultana, who is an independent MP at the moment, having had the Labour whip withdrawn, she said that Keir Starmer's support for a third runway at Heathrow was reckless and ridiculous and stupid. And it would be a death sentence for the planet, essentially. That's what she said. And now she's putting her name to a demand for a huge new international airport in Kashmir. Really extraordinary and really eye-opening, in fact, because, you know, what you have here are politicians, a political class that wants to impose net zero immiseration on people in the UK. No new airports, no more digging for coal if they had their way, no more fracking for gas, no nuclear power. They want to bring a halt to everything that might in some way intrude on the environment. And yet when it comes to Mirpur, thousands of miles away, a place that the vast majority of Britons have no connection with whatsoever, they're all in favour of these things. They're all in favour of construction and building roads, which this would no doubt entail as well. All that stuff that they say would be a death sentence for the planet if we did it, apparently is fine if Pakistanis do it. Real hypocrisy there, and really exposes the hypocritical nature of their net zero religion, which is fundamentally about, I think, immiserating Brits and not actually about doing anything about the climate.
I think it's particularly galling as well when infrastructure isn't in a particularly great place in this country either. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, no question. You know, there is a lot here that we should be building and fixing and sorting out. And yet we have members of parliament who are focusing on a different country. You know, Tahir Ali, the Labour MP for a Birmingham constituency, he's a signatory to this letter. Birmingham is a city at the moment that has got a very serious bin strike. Apparently, there are rats as big as cats roaming around the city. The city is covered in rubbish. And yet he's focusing on an airport that they need thousands of miles away. I think there are a lot of people who would rather that MPs like him cleaned up their own cities before they focus on the building up of other cities. I think it really fundamentally exposes a problem with identity politics and a little bit of a crisis of integration, because when we have members of our own parliament who are very, very interested and seemingly more excited about developments in other countries than here at home, that does suggest that there is a bit of a problem here and that there isn't as fantastic a process of integration as we might like to believe when we have politicians who focus on faraway places rather than their own constituencies.
I suppose, Brendan, the MPs who signed this letter, they would make the argument that, you know, our job is to represent our constituents. A large number of our constituents in these particular areas travel daily to Mirpur. Then why shouldn't we make their lives easier, even if it slightly strangely is a country abroad? I mean, what would you say to that kind of line of argument?
I just don't buy it. You know, I grew up in a very Irish part of London, and everyone I knew used to go to Ireland all the time. And that would entail going to places that were very difficult to get to. My family comes from the extreme west coast of Ireland. It involved driving for 24 hours down small, windy roads. We would have loved an airport in Connemara, in Galway. That would have been fantastic. But the idea that we would have lobbied our members of parliament here in Britain to agitate for that makes no sense whatsoever. You know, it was our tough luck that Ireland wasn't up to scratch. And if we wanted to lobby the Irish government, we should have done that. I feel the same about this. I think, yes, there are lots of Kashmiri origin people in Britain. There are lots of Indian people. There are lots of Jamaican people. There are lots of Irish people. There are lots of people with heritage in different parts of the world. But we can't fix all those countries' problems, and we certainly shouldn't be focusing on them. We do have to focus on what we need here. I'm worried about some of these members of parliament who seem to be driven more by an identitarian zeal rather than by a commitment to what Britain needs. So over the past few months, we've seen Muslim members of parliament arguing against a ban on cousin marriage. We've seen Tahir Ali again arguing for a clampdown on supposed blasphemy against Islam. And now we have groups of MPs calling for an airport 5,000 miles away. I'm sorry, but none of these things are in the interest of British voters. It's not in our interest that there should be an airport over there. It's not in our interest that there should be new laws against so-called blasphemy. It's not in our interest to allow cousin marriage or to celebrate cousin marriage. We do have to continually ask ourselves, what is in the best interest of the people who live in Britain, whatever their backgrounds? And I fear that too many MPs are not driven by that question.
It's a difficult one, though, isn't it? In that our country is changing. The demographics of certain constituencies are certainly changing. It is very difficult to stop this kind of sectarian politics. Do you think it is possible to do something about it, though?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. And I think actually the Justice Minister, Shabana Mahmood, is a good example of where integration really works. I think her showdown with the Sentencing Council has been quite inspiring, I think. She has asserted the primacy of Parliament against this arrogant quango that thought it could do whatever the hell it wanted in terms of bringing in new two-tier sentencing guidelines. She's also asserted the ideal of equality before the law and the idea that law should be blind. It should not judge people according to their race or their gender or their sexuality, but it should apply the law equally to everyone. This is a woman who describes herself as a devout Muslim, and yet she seems pretty devoted to the rule of Parliament and to the rule of universal principles of justice. That's brilliant. That's great. Whether her party, the Labour Party, can keep running with that commonsensical approach is a different question entirely. But it's clear that you can very easily be a person in this country who has origins elsewhere, but who is committed to the well-being of this country, committed to what this country needs. I think she demonstrates that, and there are many others who do as well. So we can tackle this sectarianism, but we have to be honest about the fact that it exists. And I just think, even though this letter about the Mirpur airport was weird and silly and a bit of a silly season story, it also did point to something more serious in our country when there are politicians who get more excited about what's happening overseas than they do about what's happening at home.
We should say that Number 10 has refused to comment on whether or not there should be an airport in Mirpur. Do you think, though, that they should actually have a stronger stance and kind of say to their MPs, you need to stop advocating essentially for foreign countries?
Yes, absolutely. I think Keir Starmer should say that they should stop doing that. It's not in the interest of all of their constituents for this to be their obsession or to something that they focus on. I also think he should tell them to calm down, because this could offend India, and India is one of our great allies. It's a very important ally. We have lots of historical connections with India, lots of people connections, lots of trade connections. India could very easily be ticked off by the sight of these British members of parliament calling for a development in Pakistani-ruled Kashmir. Kashmir is a very disputed territory. There's a lot of tension there. It's not quite clear who rules or who should rule. So they're also opening a real can of worms by interfering in that part of the world in particular. I think Keir Starmer is well within his rights to tell his members of parliament in particular, stop this. This is not our business. Let's leave it to Pakistan. Let's leave it to the rulers of Kashmir. And you focus on cleaning up Birmingham City rather than doing something in Mirpur.
Prince Harry quit a charity he co-founded after its chairwoman accused him of bullying and harassment. Our features editor, William Moore, was joined by Alexander Larman to discuss the fallout.
I can't quite believe we're once again talking about the Sussexes. Every time I think we've got to the end of this well, there's still more water that can be drawn out. This week, it's been quite a huge story, which is that Prince Harry has been accused by the chairwoman of the charity that he set up to honour his mother of various things. I think I'll read out the full quote, actually, because it's quite worth getting the full thing. She has said that her story is one of a woman who dared to blow the whistle about issues of poor governance, weak executive management, abuse of power, bullying, harassment, misogyny, misogynoir, which I believe means the hatred of black women, and the cover-up that ensued. So it's quite a remarkable string of claims there. What is really going on?
Well, it's good to be back here, Will, in these usual circumstances. And I should say at the outset, we are talking on April Fool's Day, which is appropriate because it appears that yet again, Harry, his wife, and everyone around them have made fools out of themselves. But this is a spectacular story. And actually what's interesting is that most stories about Prince Harry at the moment start off big and then get smaller because the most important story is usually the immediate one. This one started off bad and it's got worse. It's always been interesting because you look at Harry and you look at what exactly is going to be the final nail in the coffin of his reputation. And I never saw his being accused of misogynoir, of all things, because obviously he has set so much store by his own progressive credentials, and indeed he and Meghan have been very careful to present themselves as the model of a modern progressive mixed-race couple. So for him to have this woman who he's worked with for many years on the Sentebale charity turn around and effectively accuse him of racism, in addition to bullying and in addition to poor governance of this charity, which, as you say, was set up in memory of his late mother, it must hurt. And you can see that there's this briefing and counter-briefing going on in the media at the moment, where it's very clear that most stories about Harry, I don't think, bother him that much on a professional basis, might bother him on a personal basis. There might be some spilt organic whole milk in the Montecito kitchen. But he also knows that it's part of a territory, whereas this is basically cutting to the heart of who he thinks he is, because he's always tried to present himself as somebody who is above such things, who is dealing with charities and actually believing what he's doing. But for somebody who he has worked with so closely to come round with these, let's be quite honest, extraordinary and fairly unprecedented, very personal allegations, it is going to be enormously harmful, and the story is keeping on going. Now, what he must be hoping is that he's going to win, that she's going to become discredited, that he will be proved to be right, that he will be vindicated, and then, like many other stories involving him, the haters will be proved wrong and he will be able to hold his head up high. But if he isn't, and any of these stories stick, it's going to be absolutely catastrophic for him.
Well, I wondered actually if perhaps we need to explain a little for viewers who may not be aware what exactly Sentebale is and how Harry became involved with it in the first place. As you say, it was set up in honour of his mother, wasn't it?
Yes, and it's a charity that's based in Africa. It's based in Lesotho, and its whole point is that it's designed to basically give aid to people who might be suffering of HIV. And it's interesting because it's one of the very few charities that Harry has continued to support after his leaving public life. The other one, of course, being the Invictus Games. And I don't think that anybody, especially not me, a couple of weeks ago would have had it on their bingo card for 2025, that this apparently blameless organisation, which Harry was very much working on behind the scenes, it was not something which he was trumpeting the way he's trumpeted so many of his other achievements. I mean, you would have always said, well, in the credit column, there is his work in Sentebale, which he doesn't demand publicity for. He just gets on and does it. Now you're thinking, well, it's not quite clear why he hasn't demanded publicity, because clearly what's been going on. And there's been a series of very detailed allegations against him, some of which suggested that while he was filming his Netflix series with Meghan, they were basically elbowing people from Sentebale out of the way. You just think to yourself, again, these are big accusations, they're damaging accusations, and I should add, they haven't been proved yet. It's very much a he said, she said situation in the media at the moment. The fact that they exist, I mean, I think for the accusations of misogynoir and racism, he must be sitting there thinking, I'm not racist, I can't be racist. And of course, the answer is, but if somebody who is herself black making these allegations towards you, it's not enough just to bat them away and say, I can't be racist, because you're thinking, well, she isn't saying that you've bullied her out of his position. She isn't saying any of this stuff for fun. She's saying it because clearly she is as invested in the Sentebale charity as he is. So it'd be very interesting to see how this pans out, because this could be, after a very, very long list of controversies and difficulties over the last 5 years, finally the point at which the progressive establishment take against Harry.
So how would you expect the Sussexes, or perhaps the allies of the Sussexes, to respond to allegations of this kind?
Well, the allies of the Sussexes, i.e. the Sussex Squad Online, have of course taken to Twitter to lambast this Dr. Sophie Cernusca, her person, in every single conceivable way they can. And a lot of it's racist, of course, as you would expect, but a lot of it is also the deranged murmurings of a bunch of people with nothing better to do than to get on their keyboards and type away at speed. Not that I don't like these people, I just don't understand what makes them tick. But of course, what's interesting now is that you can badmouth her all you want, and it's very easy to be racist against her because she's a black woman. But I think that what would be much more interesting is if Harry has to come forward at some point within the next week, I'd say, and actually categorically go through these various accusations that she has levelled at him, not just deny them in this blanket I'm progressive way, but actually to provide some kind of explanation as to why she'd been making them, the circumstances under which these examples of bullying or bad governance took place, what his attitude is, because the only way of making this story go away is to refute it in what most people would see as a satisfactory and candid fashion.
So what are some of the specifics of the things that he's been accused of? So I obviously read the statement at the beginning of some of the more general accusations of harassment, misogynoir, and so on. But are there specifics that have been levelled against him?
Well, frustratingly, it's quite hard to actually see what the details are. I mean, there was some instance of some filming at some Netflix show where Harry was supposed to have sent an email that was angry, and it was essentially saying, you're not paying my wife enough respect, because obviously, as well we know, Harry's attitude towards his wife is one that she must be venerated and taken seriously and paid respect at all times by all people. But I can't help feeling that the meshing of Sentebale and Meghan is not a happy one, because they are essentially two entirely separate organisations and operations, and the only thing they have in common is Prince Harry. So the idea that you would essentially say, well, you weren't very nice to my wife, and that's in part why I have to resign from the charity. You think most people would see that as absolutely insane behaviour.
It's going to be quite hard for the Sussexes to respond to this, isn't it? For the reasons that you've stated about, they consider themselves very progressive people. So are they now in a situation of rather damned if you do, damned if you don't? Because if they do respond, it'd be very easy from a progressive perspective to say, well, look, you're not taking these accusations of racism and misogyny from a black woman seriously enough. That's if you do respond and don't respond, it seems to me.
Well, it seems to me as if Harry should go the full 180, that rather than being this progressive liberal figure, he should embrace life in Trump's America and come round to the idea that he can actually start to become a racist himself. He should start to say the most appalling things on the grounds what everybody else is saying. It's in my adopted country now, why shouldn't I? I mean, that might be taking it a bit far, but if Harry was just, if that's what he wanted to do, it wouldn't be as strange as it would have been a year ago. I mean, I can't see it happening somehow, but if he did, then he'd become a hero to all kinds of people who currently loathe him.
Well, maybe the MAGA crowd would stop trying to deport him. I suppose then, might we expect Harry to withdraw even further from the spotlight than he already has done?
Well, it's strange, isn't it? Because he keeps coming forward and going away. It's rather like a shy dancer at a very busy dance floor. Step on, step off, step on, step off. And of course, what's interesting is clearly a deal has been struck between him and Meghan that he had his time in the spotlight with Spare and the publication of that. Now it's her turn for the launch of As Ever, which has happened this week, in fact. And
oh yeah, should we talk a bit about that?
Yes,
and can you explain to me? I don't quite understand what As Ever actually is. It's a brand. It's a range. I mean, how would you actually describe it?
It's a nightmare. I suppose As Ever Meghan. It doesn't sound as good as she thinks it sounds, because it's not As Ever Meghan. It sounds like something that somebody might have said in a bad 70s sitcom. You can imagine an advert with Leonard Rossiter and Joan Collins ending with As Ever. There being some liqueur you can't drink or something like that. But what Meghan has offered the world is this homeware range, and it's been a very long time coming, because there was another name for it which she had to change because the name had been copyrighted. So, copyright. And so she's had to release this. There's a wildflower honey. There's a jam. I think something involving a crepe as well. But what's very funny is when you start to break it down, it's not very impressive. This thing has been months, if not years, in the making. It's quite a thin little range of stuff. And of course, it's for sale in precisely 2 places in America at the moment. One is in a shopping mall in Dallas, which means that JFK's assassination is only the second worst thing to have happened there now. And the other one, and I thought this was absolutely wonderful, is there's this town in Pennsylvania called King of Prussia, which suggests that, try as she might, Meghan still loves her royalty, doesn't she? But what I found particularly amusing is that Meghan put out this statement whereby she said, after you've finished with my raspberry preserve, give somebody a love note in the jar. And I'm thinking, somebody gave me a love note in Meghan's leftover jam jar. They really would despise me, and rightly so.
And is this been launched off the back of her Netflix show? Is it a tie-in with Netflix in some way?
It is indeed a tie-in with Netflix, but the fact that there are 2 Netflix home stores mean that, I was expecting it to be available everywhere. I was expecting to go to my local John Lewis or my local Aldi, depending on demand, and to be able to buy my Meghan preserves. And I was indeed hoping, Will, that you and I would be having a tasting at this precise moment. But I don't think we're going to be able to somehow, alas.
No, alas. Finally, I suppose, can we move on to perhaps slightly more serious royal matters, which is there was a news story last week, of course, that the King had to briefly suspend public duties because of minor hospital treatment, or at least it was said to be minor, in his ongoing cancer treatment. He's now returned to public life since. What do you make of that news last week? It's a bit of a reminder, isn't it, about his ongoing illness and the severity of it?
Certainly. One thing we have to remember is that Charles was diagnosed with cancer, a still unknown form of cancer, over a year ago. And since then, he looks noticeably older, which obviously a very gruelling form of treatment will do for him. But what I feel is quite hard to get round is the sense that we're not being given the complete picture, because Buckingham Palace and Clarence House have never been known for their openness and candour when it comes to health issues. But you get these very small updates, and it's always accentuating with the positive, especially because you send out anonymous sources to brief everything is going in the right direction. This is a very minor hiccup. Now, of course, you have to hope that is the case. You have to hope that Charles really is on the mend and that he is going to get better. But the fact that he's still having, obviously, very gruelling and very invasive cancer treatment, which is necessitating hospital visits, you would be forgiven for thinking that you're being sold a line and that there might be more to it than meets the eye, which of course brings in the other question about how much candour we can expect from the royal family, because obviously what we have with Harry and Meghan is we have perhaps too much candour. Perhaps we should be grateful that we're not having this rammed down our throats at every single moment, rather like Meghan's jam. But on the other hand, there's also the question of what is the royal responsibility to the subjects. If you're lying to the people, is that acceptable? Because essentially it is a public organisation and a private family. And we've seen over the last year, especially with Kate Middleton's illness, there's been a real sense of what are we owed? Because essentially if one of our friends was going in for cancer treatment, they would not be responsible for having to tell us everything. They would be able to keep stuff to themselves. So you can argue that at the most primal level, Charles has to have a degree of privacy, and he is owed that. But on the other hand, does that mean that people around him, courtiers around him, can put out stories which might be misleading or might at least be not being entirely accurate? So it's very much a live issue at the moment, and I think it'll probably stay like this until we're given the hopefully imminent news that Charles has the all clear. But whether we're going to hear that or not, I don't know.
The UK hosted the first international summit on tackling illegal migration, but are we likely to see any change in the vast number of boat crossings? Former Home Secretary Suella Braverman joined our deputy political editor James Heal to discuss.
Tell us what these meetings are like, and in your experience, did they achieve much?
I'm afraid it all depends on whether genuine political will is there, and that makes all the difference as to whether these meetings become mere window dressing or whether they actually lead to substantive change. You'll remember in the spring of 2023, when I was Home Secretary, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, we had the UK-French summit, which was very heavily focused on better cross-channel collaboration with the aim of combating the gangs and stopping the boats. And really substantively, practically, what did it mean? It meant the UK handing over millions, if not over £100 million to the French, and for the French to make a few commitments, which really didn't make a difference in the grand scheme of things. So it all depends on whether genuine political will is there on the part of the contributors.
Keir Starmer has been making very much of a multilateralist approach, emphasising the need for international partners to come up with international solutions to these international problems. Do you think perhaps he's being a touch naive in this approach? Obviously, day one he came in, cancelled the Rwanda scheme. Do you think that perhaps there's too much of an emphasis on negotiation without the use of a deterrent?
Yes, absolutely. Keir Starmer's adopted a wholly naive and unrealistic approach to this problem. First of all, an ideal solution to it would be a global approach. If, for example, the EU or the French unilaterally and bilaterally agreed to take returns, that would go very far in solving the problem, and pretty quickly we would see progress. But as you know, when I was Home Secretary, I constantly asked that question of EU counterparts, of the French, and they were obstinate in their position. They would always say, no, I don't know whether there's been a genuine reset in Anglo-French or EU, Anglo-French or EU-British relations to make that a realistic possibility. But that global kind of international level agreement could, if all parties were willing, could solve the problem. If you don't have the consent or the support of other international partners, then you've got to find your own solution, which is why the UK opted for the deterrence model using the Rwanda scheme. And in scrapping the Rwanda scheme on, I think, day one of his premiership, Keir Starmer has left the UK without any serious chance of fixing this problem alone.
And I mean, Labour and Keir Starmer said in the comments about that press conference, said that, they're building an arsenal of different weaponry, that they're looking at every different way, pulling every lever, as it were. Do you think Labour is going hard enough and thinking hard enough about the kind of solutions that they need to do to solve this problem, given that we are now in March and it's looking like we're going to have a record year for small boat crossing this year, and it's a problem that's only got worse over the past 5 years?
No, I don't think Keir Starmer is taking this seriously. Actions speak louder than words, after all. We heard the Home Secretary recently say that it was because of bad weather that the numbers had, or because of good weather, that the numbers had been higher than this time last year. I'm afraid bad weather cannot be UK policy to stop the boats. We need something more meaningful. That's why a deterrent does make a difference. That's why I support the principle of the Rwanda scheme, because it means that if someone arrives illegally in the UK, they will be detained and they can be removed thereafter to a safe country, whether it's Rwanda or another safe country. The Conservative government made progress in that direction. Hands up, we didn't succeed in solving it. But Keir Starmer has taken a backward step in actually scrapping the deterrent and replacing it with just more hot air, frankly.
I mean, the Labour argument will be that, look, the Tories focused on stop the boats. Our line is to start the flights. And they would say there was this figure over the weekend that there have been 24,000 returns since they came to election. I mean, obviously some of those have been incentivised to return, but do you think perhaps that Labour have been right to improve the return system, even if, as you say, they've not been very good at actually stopping those arriving here?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, Yvette Cooper does make a lot of that number of returns. But if you look under the surface, the majority of those returns were voluntary returns. So they're not enforced returns of people who were identified, arrested through immigration enforcement, and then removed from the UK against their will. If you're paying or otherwise incentivising people to return or to their home country or to leave the UK, it's a very different situation. So I'm afraid superficially it might look like some progress, but the reality is that the number of illegal arrivals has increased by over 30% since Labour came into power. The number of asylum seekers in hotels has increased since Labour came into power. And the rate of success is absolutely, is woeful.
And I mean, this is the sort of next 5 years are going to be of hard thinking opposition. That's what Kemi Badenoch has said she wants as Tory leader. I wonder, given you're one of the 121 Tory MPs, given your experience at the top of government in one of the great offices of state, I mean, what would your reflections be to drawing up a sensible and lasting Tory policy on both legal and illegal migration for 2029?
Well, on illegal migration, I think we do need to do a lot to regain the trust of the British people after having failed on our pledge to stop the boats. And I think, the step one needs to be to leave the European Convention of Human Rights. That's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the solution. And that's because human rights laws, the Strasbourg Court, combined with our judicial review, all make for a toxic combination which paralyses the Home Secretary or the government from removing those people from the UK. We also need to bolster our enforcement when it comes to immigration investigations, powers to seize phones, to seize boats, to arrest those people who are actually piloting these dinghies. Unfortunately, human rights laws have got in the way of making arrests of people who have committed quite serious offences. So there needs to be a holistic approach. And step number one needs to be to come out of the European Convention of Human Rights. And on legal migration, we again need to have a fully thought out policy on what the number has to be. I think it has to be extremely low in light of unprecedented and out of control numbers of work and study visas which have been issued in recent years. We need to turn the tide on legal migration, and we need to severely cut the numbers.
And there'll be some Tories who want to break up the Home Office. You saw that department's culture firsthand. What, in terms of machinery of government changes, do you think needs to be done for the next Conservative government?
Well, I think significant structural and administrative reform is required. The Home Office really, I think, has become bloated and inefficient as an organisation, and separating out migration and borders would be, a helpful step forward. You don't want to just move the deck chairs around. It's all about the substance and the function of what these departments do, because you don't want to create more bureaucracy. But I do think a designated and specific minister and department would be more heavily and rightly focused on the issue.
And I mean, in terms of looking back on your time in government and in terms of what we're seeing around the world, you see a number of different governments coming to power on pledges to sort of tackle migration. I mean, is there a model that you think particularly, obviously, you've spoken about a British context and sort of leaving the ECHR, but are there sort of examples that you would be looking at and have been looking about now in terms of getting forward a sensible migration policy for next time around?
Listen, I think pretty much every European country is struggling with illegal migration, and that's why it's rightly called the global migration crisis. And even our friends in America have been really grappling with their southern border as well. And in fact, when I was Home Secretary, whenever I used to meet other interior ministers, we'd all be sharing our kind of pressures and strains and challenges whilst we were all facing the same problem, really. But out of our European partners, I would say Greece has been one of the more successful nations at combating illegal migration. In 2016, 2018, they had over 1 million illegal arrivals through their land border between Greece and Turkey, and also via maritime routes. And that number fell by over 90% over the ensuing years. And when I went to visit Greece as Home Secretary, that number was in the low tens of thousands. Now, I would definitely take that rate of decline and massive progress. And they did that by building a wall. They built a wall on the Greek-Turkey land border, very militarized wall, with armored points stationed along it, vehicles, drones, very, very robust border security was put in place. And as a result, the numbers crossing across that Greek-Turkey land border fell significantly. Another country I think that's succeeded outside the EU is Australia. Australia made huge progress in combating its small boat problem several years ago, and they did that by again using a kind of deterrence of people who would arrive illegally on the Australian territory were very swiftly detained and removed to another territory. They would be removed to Papua New Guinea or Nauru, and give or take various nuances and other issues. Overall, it was a big deal in solving their problem. So there are countries who have succeeded in combating illegal migration. It does come down to political will, and it does come down to really being willing to radically reform your enforcement and your laws.
America's Liberation Day. President Donald Trump announced sweeping new tariffs in his bid to address trade imbalances and bolster American manufacturing. Freddy Gray spoke to William Clouston, leader of the Social Democratic Party, who argues that tariffs and protectionism are necessary.
William, are you feeling liberated this morning from the tyranny of neoliberalism?
I am, yes. I think it's a very exciting time, Freddie. I think many of us who've been arguing against free trade liberalism and free trade purism, and looking at the industrial capacity of our countries and the extent to which that's been gutted and the extent to which that's harmed a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of communities, are very excited about this. I think it's a necessary correction. If I were American, I'd be jumping with joy at this. I think it has union support, and a lot of people are very excited about it. I don't think it'll be easy. I think reindustrialization is a major challenge. Let's hope they haven't left it too late. But I think as a policy turn, it's absolutely necessary, and I support it.
But you're not American, obviously. You're British, like me. And it does look as though it could be, even though Britain is on this 10% rate, not the European 20% rate, it does look as though Britain could be in a bit of trouble, particularly with this 25% tariff on cars, which we export a lot of cars to America. And we've talked before about how the American and the British economies are very intertwined, so much so that we are in some ways a vassal state. Our economy is a vassal economy of America's. It's not looking good for us in the short term, is it?
It's not brilliant for auto exports, I agree. I think the 25% tariff is not helpful at all to Jaguar and to Nissan and to the other UK domestic producers. But a 10% ad valorem tariff across the board, I'm not too concerned with. Every time anyone on our side of the argument, and there are precious few people in the UK that argue for tariffs and industrial protection, but every time we argue for it, people say, well, it'll be a disaster. But I always remind people that the currency, cable, the rate at which, sterling trades with the US dollar fluctuates quite markedly. I mean, the last 3.5 years, the peak to trough difference, we're at 1.41 against the dollar, and down in the trust thing at sort of 1.1, which is a 27% difference. And if you're a UK exporter of a car or anything else, that is bigger than anything that's being proposed right now. And exporters have to deal with currency fluctuations just as now they're going to have to deal with a tariff. But I think it's interesting, Freddie. I mean, I think there are some favored nations in Trump world. And if you look at Australia and Singapore and Britain at 10%, we've actually done very well, and we should be very happy about that.
And of course, that is a benefit of Brexit, which the Labour Party are quite keen to talk about how Keir Starmer has his softly, gently approach has paid off. But it might actually be really to do with Brexit, which I'm rather less comfortable talking about.
I think that's probably true. It's one of these determined issues, and you don't know. Keir Starmer's trying his best. Obviously, I don't particularly rate him, but it may just be that Trump. I think Trump is clearly driven partly by sentiment and things, and I think he's partly Scots heritage and so on. He doesn't like the EU very much, and it may just be down to that. But whatever it is, it doesn't really concern me. I agree that the auto exporters from this country are going to have a harder time. But I think I would go back to the point. I always go back to the key point. The free trade purists who have allowed the US and the British economy to be gutted, to have these persistent large trade deficits which accumulate losses and degrade our capital account every year. They have no answer, Freddie, to correcting this. And I just don't think you can go on. I think it's going to be much harder for the UK, because I think the US is much more capable of being a decent autarky if it wanted, or semi-autarky, has much more power. But nevertheless, I don't think we can go on with the policies we've had. And I think it's a necessary historic correction against this sort of ideological, very naive free trade purism, which is not just the trade account, Freddie. It's the fact that you're not secure in a world where you've deindustrialized. I think Trump's speech was very interesting when he was talking about the capacity of the Americans, for instance, to build ships compared to China. And we've been literally gaslit for the last 40 years by these free trade purists to think that it's price. It's the cheap T-shirts. It's the cheapness trumps everything. Well, it doesn't. Sometimes security, national security trumps it. And I think Vance and Trump get that.
Well, I mean, do they though? Because it is quite hard to decipher what Trump's sort of bigger logic is sometimes, because, I mean, he talked about them being reciprocal yesterday, and they're not exactly reciprocal. And of course, at some level, he seems to be entirely liberal about it. It's just he feels it's unfair. He would rather, it seems, have completely fair free trade and not have protectionism, or at least he sometimes seems to talk like that. J.D. Vance may talk differently. But the overall message of the Trump administration is not entirely coherent, I don't think.
Well, certainly I agree with you. It's not coherent. I mean, his first foray into this against Mexico and Canada, I think the attitude towards Canada was bizarre, and using tariffs as a sort of semi-transactional thing I think is quite foolish. If I was an American, what I want the administration to do is to set tariffs and keep them, and try and give some policy stability to industrialists and investors. I think that makes sense. But I don't actually buy. I mean, there's a large report being published, 180-page report, which provides some background to the logic of the non-tariff barriers that they're talking about, and the tariff barriers that Trump is responding to when he says reciprocal. And quite comically saying he's very generous. I don't really buy that, Freddie. I think if you look at it, the first little look at I had on trading economics was that roughly the magnitude of the Trump tariffs roughly match the size of the bilateral trade deficit they have with each country. So the Chinese, the Americans are running a goods deficit with the Chinese of about $350 billion a year. And they have the biggest, because he put 20% on before, and now there's another very large tariff going on. So I think that's what it is. And in a sense, I don't think it matters, because he's going to put them on. If he sticks to them, the policy should work in the long run.
But you think that Trump is right to just look at deficits in quite such it sometimes seems simplistic way, because these are very, very complicated things. And there's a row at the moment about how the Trump administration calculated what they think the tariffs against them are, and whether that's in any way accurate. I have no way of knowing. I'm not an expert about trade economics by any means. But the point is that it's not as simple as just looking at a deficit and saying, well, that means you charge a tariff of this.
I agree. It's not. And actually the external tariff applied by countries is not a simple predictor of what happens anyway. So, 2 weeks ago I was in Seoul in South Korea, and Trump is right that if you look around the streets, 80-90% of the cars are made, and the buses and the trucks and everything else are made in South Korea. And Trump is moaning about that. But it's not just the tariff. If you look at the tariff, I mean, if an American manufacturer wants to break into the South Korean market, they can do so. But there are non-tariff barriers. I mean, people have reported, for instance, Freddie, that if a rich South Korean businessman were to buy a BMW or a Mercedes, they may get a tax inspection. That type of thing does go on. It goes on all over the place. And Trump, this is why I don't think it matters in a sense on the justification. If he sticks to his guns, I think you'll get a reordering of international trade. And you have to correct these imbalances. I would say What people need to realize is the imbalances and the deficits and the accumulated debt that countries like the United States and Britain are accumulating. You can't free trade your way out of that, I'm afraid. You can't. You've got to deal with it. And it's not in the interests of the world economy in the long run for these imbalances not to be corrected. They need to be corrected. So I say bring it on. I think it's a good move, and I hope he sticks to it.
Well, let's get on to that in a second. But one other thing I wanted to ask you about the sort of calculation of it is that I think on the sheet that they gave out and on the board that Trump was holding up, there was an asterisk. Yeah. And the asterisk said this includes currency manipulation.
Yes.
And I sometimes think, I don't understand the economics of this entirely, but I sometimes find America complaining about that is a bit rich because, of course, they have the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So really they can do and have done what they want with the dollar, and that affects all of us, while complaining about other countries fiddling with their currency, which undoubtedly China does on a massive scale.
Yeah, well, Switzerland does, and the European Union does through the euro, which the euro is lower as a currency than the German D-mark would be, for instance. So all of this is going on. This is why I sort of chuckled to myself, having read on this topic for 15 years and argued about it for about as long. When people say you'll start a trade war, you're in a trade war every single hour of every day. You're already in a trade war. You know, people, the Chinese have been manipulating their currency in their own interests for a long time. I mean, on the dollar, the problem is on the upside, Freddie. So the dollar is too strong for many American manufacturers to export. I mean, it's not competitive. So, I mean, you know, yes, it helps American corporations acquire foreign assets sometimes, and banks and investment companies. It does. We've seen a lot of that. From Wall Street and private equity and so on. But it's not helpful for manufacturers. And this is the point. I always get back to it. You can look at trade in an entirely technical way as an economist, if you like. But the reason that it gets back to political economy always is that the union workers and the United Auto Workers, Sean Fain, their leader, is absolutely in full support of this. And if you read the stuff he's put out and that union has put out, they make a very important point, which is, Trump's putting, quite heavy tariffs on auto imports, but you've got car plants all over the United States, not just in Michigan, but all over the United States that are under capacity, and you've got laid off workers. And if you give it long enough, my bet would be that those plants are repriced and American workers are going to benefit from it. So that's it. And the other technical thing that you might be interested in, people say, Trump's going to create a wave of inflation. And again, I disagree. Goods imports as a percentage of the US economy is about 11%. Now, if all of the tariff cost was passed straight through, you might have inflation might tick up by about 2.5%. But the point is, Freddie, it won't. And all of history proves that it won't, because none of these price changes will be passed straight through. Some of the price, if you're a cheese manufacturer in Devon, you're exporting cheese to the United States, some of the increase in the tariff will just be absorbed by you as a producer. Some of it will be absorbed by distributors and retailers in the United States. Not all of it will be passed through. So, you'll read a lot of scare stories. Now, I'm not underplaying what's happening. This is a revolution. It really is, but it's a necessary revolution. And I don't think it'll be as bad as people say. Certainly, it should be positive for the United States.
What you say about fighting a trade war every day makes sense to me. But there is also the concern about escalation.
Yeah.
And with China, that is a legitimate concern. And you could actually have a breakdown of the global economy, which may be a necessary thing, but it could be catastrophic.
No, I think there are risks there, and I'm not denying that. But as I say, there are risks in leaving a time bomb of accumulating huge deficits and costs as well. That's also a risk. If the wheel falls off the entire US economy and you get US fiscal deficits, for instance. So some economists are already saying that's going through an event horizon. You can't bring it back. That is very risky. So I'm not denying that. But I think overall, you've got to deal with these issues. And I would just say in terms of retaliation, I would predict, and you can mark this, and I think I'm pretty sure I'm right, that a lot of the retaliation will be symbolic. It's a bit like the European Union's retaliation on on motorcycles or particular agricultural products. They'll do that and they'll say they've retaliated. But you know what, Freddie? If you're a surplus country, you can't win a trade war by putting up tariffs against the person that's put up a tariff against you. You can't, just on the maths. So Trump has a lot of cards in his deck, and he's going to play them. And I wouldn't, there's not a lot China and the European Union can do. There's not a lot Britain can do about this. It's a reset, and the buying entity has the power.
You sound quite sanguine about the possibility of inflation in America and on American consumers. But part of Trump's plan, we don't quite know, is to carry on the tax cut and possibly even extend it or make the tax cut bigger. He's also talking about a Doge dividend, giving money to American taxpayers that they've saved from finding fraud and inefficiencies in the federal government. Could those things combined not create, with the tariffs, not create an inflationary spiral?
I don't think they'll create an inflationary spiral. I think inflation could tick up. And we saw that massively, at the end of COVID. So, that can happen. But if you look at the US economy, clinically now, if you just look at the data, very little of it is predicting a recession or an inflationary uptick. No, it isn't, just isn't. All the key things that economists look at, heavy truck sales, this is not indicating a recession. The Britain is close to a recession, and parts of Europe are close to a recession. The United States is. So again, we'll have to wait and see. I think some things, people tend to think some corrections are bad, and I'm just saying that some of them are good. I mean, for instance, if there was a correction to the S&P 500, I think that would be a good thing. The S&P 500 is massively, massively overpriced, and it can't go on. So if you got a run on that, I would say good. And if it settles down lower, good. That's something that won't have to be dealt with later. I mean, you raised the question of revenue, the federal budget generally. There is a slight. Certainly some of his advisors are very bullish on how much money they're going to get from imports, and from tariffs themselves. But the logic doesn't really support them in that. I mean, if you correct your trade balance, you'll have fewer imports and you have less to tax. So all these claims about Navarro making claims that he's going to collect X tens of billions I don't know. I don't think that necessarily follows. If the policy works, logically, you won't get quite as much. So we'll have to wait and see. But as I say, this is very exciting times in a way. Those of us that wanted trade protectionism and industrialization brought onto the agenda are jumping for joy. If I was American, I'd be very happy. I'm a little bit concerned. I think our politicians and our political class are behind the curve on this. And I've always argued that the first thing we need to realize is, and there is a turn here, is that protectionism and industrial policy is legitimate. And it's a tool that we should use.
I hear what you're saying about maybe the stock market does need to come down. Maybe it has been too high for too long. But one of the reasons why it is so high is because of large amounts of retail investing. And this is not rich people, just creaming money off the stock market. It's almost everyone. It's a large number of British people are connected to the stock market in some way through pensions or through their own investments. And in fact, I believe one of the reasons for the Great Depression in the 1930s was a sort of mania of retail investing, similar to the one we had during COVID. Yeah. Do you think that if that bubble bursts, I mean, I think it might not be a case of rebalancing, but upending?
Yeah, no, there's a wealth effect. I mean, if you get a serious correction, obviously sentiment changes, people's propensity to buy is reduced. So there is a wealth. I can't deny that will be, but you've got to ask yourself what the alternative is. I mean, the thing that's not helpful in the United States, I think it's practiced less here, but a lot of US retail investors borrow money to invest. I think it's very foolish. They shouldn't be doing that. And that's asking for a bubble in itself. But whether it happens in the next week or month or quarter or this year, the S&P 500 is massively overvalued. I don't think the British stock market, the FTSE 100 and 250 are actually. They're not too bad. So you might get some effect. You will have some effect if the S&P falls. But I'm afraid to say, I'm just saying it's It's an iron law. It's overvalued, so it will correct, I'm afraid.
Well, one way the Trump administration, I think, aimed to keep inflation down is energy, firing on all cylinders to make cheap energy. If you look at Britain, and if we are entering into a more protectionist era, an era where countries do need to onshore their own manufacturing and so on, with our current energy costs, we're just not going to be able to exist in that world, really, as an economic force.
I think it's you make a very serious point. I think we're in a real bind in Britain. The whole of the political class is net zero persuaded. They've been high time preference. No, since Blair onwards, right through the coalition, no serious long term planning has been undertaken. In fact, part of the problem, as I've always argued, is ideological, because the political class are all liberals of various kinds and they can't bear to plan anything. They think it's just going to look after itself. But we are in a bind. I mean, for UK manufacturing is food and business to business higher end stuff. So, all the consumer durables and a lot of the stuff, the bread and butter stuff, we just don't make. And unless we change the energy cost structure, we can't make. So I would we advocate as a party, the SDP, to roll out a British, nuclear power sector again. We used to dominate this, but it's yet another thing that the political class have just let go. But you are in a bind. I mean, you can't, about half of our trade deficit is consumed in energy imports. It's absolutely mad. Do you know, Freddie, what the biggest single export from the United States to Britain is?
Is it gas?
Crude oil.
Oil. Yeah.
And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. We have Rosebank and Shetland, and they're prevaricating. They just can't get their policy right. So, I would just open that now. I mean, it seems mad to me to import crude oil and refine it and from the United States. But it does illustrate the point I'm making, which is that, a country that's on receipt of a tariff war from the United States, what are we going to do? Put tariffs up on oil and increase our costs further? You're not going to do that. You're not going to. So you can't do a lot. A lot of it will just settle out. But I think we want to go. You need a government that takes these things seriously. One of the things that a British government could do, and it's non-tariff, but is just promote the idea of buying British and being, proudly buying British and supporting companies that are producing in this country and are British owned. That would be a start.
I saw a headline I thought you might find amusing about British Steel's Chinese owner has concerns, I think it was.
Yes. No, it's tragic, Freddie. It really is. I mean, it should never have been Chinese owned, just as Tata shouldn't have been allowed to own steel production in Port Talbot. And actually Scunthorpe is a perfect example of the sort of degrading problem you have. I mean, they make all the railway lines, and if it closes, we've got, we're not the Indian Railways or Santa Fe in the United States, but we have a lot of rail track. And if that plant closes, we will be importing rail track from abroad. It's just absolute insanity. So I want I want the government to wake up and realise and get serious about industrial policy and protectionism. And it's, Trump and Vance have their boxing gloves on, and we should join them.
Well, you say you call it free market purism, and it does seem to have been almost a sort of religious belief about the power of markets to do great things. I mean, it stems from the fact that markets do have this power. Markets are extraordinary things that can change the world and lift people out of poverty. Do you think, are we not in danger of turning against actual capitalism itself, which is not necessarily the root of these evils?
No, I take the point. I mean, I always, on any trade debate, I always open up and acknowledge the benefits to international trade, and they're absolutely considerable. This country can't produce oranges, you've got to import them, and there are advantages. International trade has spread wealth, increased production. And one thing I'll never argue about is that, WTO style free trade does make goods cheaper. It really does. But my argument is that puts the interests of the consumer above the interests of the domestic producer. And if you just don't have an eye on that, if you just let it go, then, the cheapest producers, often using slave labor and often not adhering to any environmental standards, will just take the palm. And I think the biggest one that you can look at right now, is Chinese electric vehicles. They produce tens of millions of them domestically a year. They have practices that we wouldn't allow in this country. They have a massive price advantage. Now, I'll just say it. They've got a price advantage of about a third in all markets: Australia, United States, Europe, and here. So if you sit down and it's hello birds, hello sky, everything will be fine, you will not have a domestic car industry. That's just reality. I'm afraid the Chinese would have it all. So on something like this, I'm not arguing that it hasn't, international trade and production specialization hasn't increased production. It has. But if you're totally naive about it, it will hurt your country, and you'll end up a sort of beggar state. And that happens. So there has to be a quantum, and you have to have your eye on what is happening in a bigger scale. So that's all I'm arguing for. I'm very pro market. I'm very pro international trade, but not to a crazy extent. You have to look at what's in the national interest.
Is our future better governed by the private sector? Natasha Farrow spoke to Harriet Green, the founder of investment firm Basis, who are dedicated to solving public service failures.
We have set up essentially a private fund. We call ourselves an investment firm in order to invest in companies that are building where the state is failing. A loftier way of putting that is we're looking to outcompete the state, but as it stands at the moment, we are writing checks in early stage businesses, much like a venture capitalist would, but with that specific directionality around businesses that are looking to either materially improve existing services and how they work, the processes and operations behind them, or they are looking to provide an alternative to individuals, citizens on the ground.
And this can be anything from potholes to prisons, or? Yes,
we've seen companies that are trying to fix cracks in pavements, which always makes for a really amusing read, actually. All the way to thinking about procurement across the NHS, rethinking law enforcement, thinking about energy as well. And it's worth mentioning that we kind of have different ways of thinking about sectors across the economy as well. So obviously there's really obvious public service sectors. Mentioned a couple of those just now, whether that's health or education, law enforcement, defence. But there are plenty of sectors that we see having been almost turned into a system rather than being a marketplace because of state impact and interference over the years. Nobody's fault, but post-Second World War, we've just had this layering up. And so when we look at things like housing or energy, we see markets that aren't really markets anymore. And so our kind of lens there is to think about how to remarketize them and build them out in a way that is more centered around the consumer, the individual.
And some of your clients or some of the businesses that you invest in, do they come at this saying, when they make a pitch, this is where the government's failing, or this is where the state has let us down, we want to fill this gap? Or is it genuinely a sort of profit-driven idea where they think, I can see an opportunity here, let's fill it?
Well, interestingly, it's both. I think when someone is building a company and they're going out to get funding, like the commercial impetus is everything. Like how you're going to make money is the be all and end all. And perhaps we'll touch on kind of how that interacts with the idea of public services anyway, and kind of thinking about the 21st century and how we might need to kind of rethink our kind of posture towards those things. But interestingly, a lot of the companies we speak to share both the kind of sentiment that things aren't really working, and obviously they'll have a very narrow gauge focus that they're looking at, a problem they're looking to solve. And a lot of them are very, some of them are kind of, of a kind of sort of young libertarian bent and really fired up about bringing something that takes a big thing and makes it smaller, and why that shift from a centralized system in a given market is really exciting. And some of them do just really want to do good and improve something that perhaps they've had personal experience of, and that's often the way with people who go to build businesses. You know, they will have had a personal experience, whether that's in their job or in their personal life as well.
Well, naturally, that leads me on to asking you about your background and how you got into this sort of sector.
I can't remember a time when I didn't think that the thing that needed changing in our world was government. I think I've thought that since I was a child, not in a kind of sort of precocious child sitting posturing on the world, but just that anything I found that I thought was a bit rubbish, I could trace a line back to it having been victim to over-centralisation. And I think I sort of spent time in a non-profit environment. I set up a non-profit after university. I then worked as a journalist. I then set up my own company, which has allowed me to set up Basis. And there was just a moment in time where I sort of went, I'm going to do this now. It's time to do my life's work. And the thing that I could start with was building out an investment firm that allowed us to help bring to fruition some of the fantastic builders and their ideas, which will, the hope is materially improve life for people, not just across the UK, but across the Western world. We've got a portfolio company operating in Texas and California, for example.
So Basis isn't just in the UK; it's over.
No,
America
we look.
As well.
Yeah, we look at. I mean, there's a kind of I suppose a footnote to that, which is that you're looking for businesses that could scale internationally as well. So we're taking a lot of the ways that people think about investing at VC level, venture capital level, in terms of that early stage risk and opportunity. But it's also important to us that these businesses can be funded even if they don't necessarily have the hallmarks of venture-like returns, which is a bit more of a kind of quasi-private equity way of thinking about investment. But yeah, this is doing the investment side of Basis, which is our kind of V1, if you like, is my way of starting to proactively try and chunk off a little bit of how do we get some improvements here. And I think this is a great time. There is so much going on. There's so many people talking about changes that need to be made. There are so many people doing things. And if we can all move in concert and cooperate and collaborate and whatnot, I think it feels like a good time to be doing it.
Yeah, I mean, so much political appetite globally with Malay. Obviously, you have Doge, Trump. Did that fill you with a lot of confidence?
I think there's a UK way of doing things that we haven't felt out yet. And I don't think it needs to be brash or kooky or partisan. I think that those things give you a kind of a litmus for something maybe being timely and it's a good opportunity. I mean, we put Basis live in November of last year. But I think part and parcel of why a lot of people are sort of mobilising now is almost they're both encouraged by other changes that perhaps feel similar in terms of the affinity with the kind of outcomes and what we're all pushing to, but they also want to carve a unique way of doing it that is fitting for a given society and country, which I think is the opportunity we have now here.
We had a really interesting interview with Rory Sutherland. It was about 6 months ago now. And it was about why is Britain poor? And he written this piece about the fact that the political class is run by lawyers and economists. And so the state is just by definition just there's so much friction and it's so bureaucratic. Now, this would be slightly different to what Basis offers, but Is the world that you envision something where you have more business owners working within the state, or do you only think that this can be done through, well, what you'd like to achieve can be done through the market forces, so like a more libertarian sort of perspective?
Yeah, the latter. I think, but I think it's important that we strip back labels on it and just say how do we incentivize people to do good work, and the work that they want to do. And I think there's a few things to unpack there. I'm not convinced that anyone in the public sector at the moment is incentivized in a way that gets good outcomes for the work that they're doing, but also like that's pretty miserable. And you know, we often talk about kind of just this groundswell of people who are working for the state, whether that's frontline workers or civil servants, and just how divorced you are from something that you can actually control and grow, which is this is what you see. You see it in the private sector as well. And one label I will use is corporatism. You know, when you've got businesses backed by state privilege, and by that I mean that sort of have been able to get as large as they are through cheap money, and regulatory environments that create barriers to entry that privilege them. You get the same phenomenon where people just kind of do these jobs. David Graeber, the late anthropologist, referred to them as bullshit jobs. You know, there are shit jobs like cleaning a toilet, and then there are bullshit jobs. And so across the economy, we've got a lot of people who shunt things from hither to thither without actually having a high degree of agency, which I think is pretty miserable for them, but also...
Or incentives.
No incentives, just to kind of pick something up and run with it and do it, and which looks so different to sort of the notion of how do we solve this problem? Okay, go and do it, which is what you've got at the earliest stages of entrepreneurship and when you're building companies. And I think another thing to note is when you're in that environment, everything is about de-risking and not acting in a way that is going to disrupt the apple cart, and that's institutionalization. Like that at scale, that's what it looks like. You're not looking, if you are a large bank or management consultant or arm of the civil service, you are not looking to get people in who are movers and shakers in terms of process and operations. You're looking to get people in who can bring ideas while towing the line, and I think that's that's a rather too metaphorical way of putting it, but you know, we all kind of know what that looks like, and you know, whether one is doing that kind of work themselves or has someone in their family who's doing it, you kind of know that if you're in the private sector, it feels a bit different.
I want to hear a little bit more about some of the companies that you've invested in, just a few more details about them. So, I mean, are they especially political themselves? You said that they're problem solvers, but
yeah, and we don't talk about politics. Like we're not, we don't exist to. I mean, there's people doing good work. You know, Douglas Carswell putting out his plan to get Britain back on track last week. There's people doing good work in trying to streamline and improve the state. When we're doing what we do, we are entirely in the world of supporting companies to build themselves and to get to a point where they're revenue generating and then hopefully profitable, which is really hard. So while there are sentiments around the kind of the why and what drives people, we're not coming at things with a kind of political hat on. The touch point might be that they are doing something which does have a kind of politicization to it. But just to pick on a few, we've got a business which is a marketplace for procurement. So it's an AI-enabled marketplace for procurement. They're operating out in the US, and what they enable is for small businesses to become regulatory and compliant so that they can go for contracts with government agencies, so like councils. And that felt important. My kind of finger in the air is sort of, does this make the state bigger or smaller? I want to make it smaller, and that, while you can sort of go, oh yeah, but it kind of makes it more efficient, it does, but it does so in a way that benefits more individuals. If one of the examples the founder always gives is kind of Independence Day parade, and everyone in a small town is waving a flag that has been made in China, but they've got a local flag maker down the road, and that so building practical solutions to enhance the procurement process in a way that remarketizes it is really exciting. We've got another business completely different, which is a full stack robotic kitchen. They've got a restaurant, their first restaurant out in the Brunswick Centre here in London. And
sorry, what's a robotic kitchen?
So a robotic kitchen is a kitchen where your food is made by a robot.
Wow.
And the reason that's exciting, no one actually wants to see, I mean, it's a dispensing system essentially. Yeah. But the reason that's exciting is, with a backdrop of very high labour costs, you can incrementally get more margin back the more of that process you automate. And the way that you use people in that environment is for customer experience. So, hello, how are you today at the door, having conversation with someone. But the really exciting thing about that business is that they are able to track data around the customers that they've got in. So, how frequently are you coming in? What are you ordering? How much waste is there when you finished with your salad bowl? And that is so exciting to me, because when we think about health, obviously there are sort of numerous kind of low-hanging fruit, but it's going to be really hard to do, things that could be done to help people, like having access to comprehensive medical records still hasn't been cracked. And actually, if you think, like, what's the really dead obvious thing we could do, that's one thing probably needs to emanate from a private player, but it kind of doesn't matter. It just makes people's lives better. Another thing we think about is paediatric subscriptions, so the ability to ring up a doctor, the same doctor, rather than having to go to A&E with your young child, which so many people just end up in that horror position, and kind of think, hang on a sec, when I was younger I had a family doctor, and now this is the kind of like faceless interaction that goes on, and so there's all those sorts of things. But one of the ways we think about health is, how would you reinvent this? So you can run sort of thought experiments, like if you built a hospital from scratch, how much would go into the hospital and how many things would become distributed across layers of society, where you'd just provide some of those things fundamentally differently, whether it was paediatric care, whether it was private A&E, just to alleviate some of the pressure. But more pie in the sky is how you help people think about their health in a way that is seamless and passive. So what's really exciting to me about the idea of having somewhere where people can go and eat something and perhaps get some information about how they are eating, what they're eating, is that we start to get a glimmer of not having to go on an app and input all the food that you ate, which is really hard, because no one wants to do that for food. No one wants to do it for their finances. Everyone hates thinking about those things.
The restaurant will calorie count for you. So
the idea of a restaurant that calorie counts for you, I've got a friend in the US who's looking at this sort of thing for gyms as well. The idea that, like an Amazon Go for gyms, you're going in, you're doing your workout, and you've just clicked once into the app, and then you're going to get a load of information about how you could lift better, or whatever it is that people do in gyms. And so those things are not, it's not like we're sort of going, oh, look, government health, it's quite a long kind of string that we're drawing there. But I think that's precisely the point, like how much health should sit with individuals, how much of their own health journey should they have control over and be able to readily access information on. And the challenge with where we are at the moment is, I think a lot of people just feel kind of stuck, like helpless, that they're sort of ending up in A&E with their young kids. They're on a wait list. I mean, NHS wait lists, everyone's got a horror story. Yeah. And the second order effects of some of those things as well are really considerable. So the more in our minds we can take something back to what is the smallest thing we can do here that will benefit the individual, that's where we start from.
And the business owners that you've met so far, is brain drain a thing? I understand that BASIS is an international project, but have you noticed that the quality of people in the private sector is being downgraded in the same way that you think the public sector?
People going to the States?
Going to the States, yeah. Dubai.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I probably have at least one conversation a week with a young founder where they've got an idea of something they want to work on, but they think they're going to go to America to either continue cooking that idea or to work on something else and to get a job somewhere. And I've been doing what I can to put them in touch with exciting businesses here in the UK, and sort of go, okay, well, maybe there's a matchmake that can happen here, because a lot of this actually is that we have a very small tech network, but I think people are sort of being left out in the cold a little bit in terms of people who can actually build stuff and are coming in their early 20s, ready to hit the ground, and they're looking at the US and they're thinking, well, I'm just going to get a higher caliber of conversation, more aspiration and more opportunity out there. That's a real shame. And that's, this is entirely separate to the millionaires are leaving for sunny climes and whatnot. This matters a lot more to me, because that's a cap on our aspiration as a country and what we're offering people.
Why do you want to stay in Britain?
I love it. It's my home. A few people have asked me that, and things would have to be so much worse. And I'm talking kind of like we're all out kind of, camping on pavements, kind of worse for me to go, oh, okay, do we sort of enact some kind of mass exodus? I mean, it's never been something that I could conceive of doing.
But if you're a business owner, you're profit driven, there's every possibility that if you took BASIS elsewhere, you would make much more money.
Oh yeah. I mean that's all. I can already reel off how we lose more money under this government, and I can do that on a family basis as well. My other half is a founder, but that's not interesting to people, and it's not important. I'm very privileged to be doing what I'm doing in life anyway. I don't think it's a helpful narrative for people to start sort of going, I'm having to pay more tax here, there and everywhere, I'm going to leave. I'm not sure it's doing the tech sector a huge amount of benefit to keep kind of returning to it, except if we can make the point with it that the government is really rubbish at redistribution, but that's a centralisation point again. If you could hand your money straight over to someone in need, and obviously there's a big can of worms there at the moment, but it's not really a point of, I don't want to give all my money. I don't want to give all of my money inefficiently. And I think that's where we need to extend the narrative there, because actually it's just a bit of a turn off to keep talking about it for most people. And my attitude is you just take it. Because it's not anyone's fault. You can see how we've got here. And you're going to, I'm going to do what I do regardless and anyway, in spite of and because of, and I think that's how the majority of people think. There are plenty of fantastic founders out there who are building companies and they've got their head down, and they'll take the additional tax burden and the flack because they're always going to do that, and they are living out their purpose.
I want to ask you about the private sector that is used by the government currently, which is slightly different to what BASIS offers. I understand that, but a lot of the viewers will firstly want to know How is it different to what Basis provides? And two questions. But for example, what's going on with the Birmingham bins? Can something like Basis facilitate a sort of immediate reaction to a crisis? We're going to come in and set up a private company to clean up all the bins because the public sector's on strike. Is there a remit for that?
Okay, yeah. So a few things there. So one of the kind of manifest examples, and probably the manifest example of where the state has got to, is that we have this enormous dark state or shadow state, where you've got these huge contractors like G4S, like Serco, who are providing things on behalf of the state. The problem with the procurement process and the fact that we have these massive contracts is that there's no market to it, and I know we've touched on that in kind of various ways. So absolutely part of Basis's aim is to reimagine some of that from the ground up. Worth noting that we are teeny tiny and 4 months old, so I don't think it's going to be tomorrow that we are going sort of up against G4S. And you know, being reasonable, there are plenty of areas where contractors can do a really great job. And actually, you know, I've got a G4S chap down in my local Waitrose who has been brought in as security, but he's so great at helping people find things around the shop. That's really interesting, actually, because it says one of the things we think about is how to rethink law enforcement. And one way of thinking about that is the kinds of powers that private security individuals can have, and kind of how they can be kind of more present in a given space or community. So we're really teeny tiny. The procurement economy, if you like, and it is that big. The reflex we have for the government in deciding on something and then enacting it through this kind of shadow layer.
HS2 is probably the most shocking example, maybe, or
I mean it's everything. It's all infrastructure projects. It's people that you're going to speak to in your GP surgery. It's people who are on the streets supporting the police. But I think that word supporting is important because, again, we're looking at mismatched incentive structures. So there's a huge amount to unpack there. And so I'll just talk a bit about bins. I'm really keen on bins as a kind of thing in life. So you spend a bit of time every couple of days thinking about them, as you do, and public toilets.
More so now than ever after seeing the footage of Birmingham.
So bins are difficult to think about innovating in because there is a fundamental kind of economy of scale issue. So, and what I mean by that is if you're on street A and I'm on street B and you've got your bins out and I've got my bins out, but none of our neighbours do, it's very difficult to conceive of how you create a profit-making enterprise that can pick up your bin and my bin, but no one else's bin. So part of the state owning bin collection, it's blanket coverage. You don't have this situation where you're having to get opt-in customers. But I think, and actually that is a precursor kind of challenge that limbers up to the free rider problem in public services. Which, if you've got a public good at the heart of something, is always going to be a massive challenge. And it's one of two challenges we deal with at Basis. The other one is the double spend problem. People are already paying tax. Who's going to pay for these opt-in services that we're looking at? But there is the application of technology, and I know people put that forward as a salve and silver bullet for everything, you know, well, what if it's tech-enabled? But bins is one of the things where actually it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that if you could log when you were putting your rubbish out, you can then close that temporal information asymmetry. You know, when's your bin going out? When's my bin going out? Where's everyone else's bin? In order to get a much more exact reading, like a marauder's map of bins, a much more exact reading of where does something need picking up and how should it be prioritised by the company picking it up. So nobody has built that yet. Somebody did try to do Uber for bins in New York, and this is going back several years now, and it didn't work out. It's really difficult because it's right on the coalface of we are genuinely already paying for bins, and it's not quite the same as your health. Bins can annoy you, but you're not going to go, I really do need this operation, or my other half really needs this operation, so we're going to pay for it. People aren't quite that riled up about bins. That says it does get people's goats, but I think there's that kind of technologized piece that can be thought about, and you can overlay that across multiple sectors. But with bins, it feels like something where there should be a sort of straightforward solution for logging litter and it being collected, or I should say logging rubbish, and that's a slip because we're now in an environment where there is a lot more litter and there's a lot more fly tipping. I think that's a different issue, actually. I think that's a attitude and sentiment issue. But obviously, it still needs clearing up, as first and foremost. So then the question becomes, is it better for government to get someone to build some software at great expense and try and roll that out? Or do you try and build a private sector solution? We call it an opt-in solution, not to be disingenuous, but just because we're aware that, as you mentioned, when people think about the private sector, they think about G4S and they think about things that are just instruments of the state, as opposed to excited, fired up people innovating.
On bins,
yeah,
is recycling a waste of time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I see. It's a big fat myth, isn't it? So I think there's a sort of whole kind of panegyric that someone could go off on, sort of that we kind of like atone for a whole variety of things by washing out the tuna tin, and the tuna tin is the thing that I can't do it.
It's the raw chicken for me.
And yeah. In 2008, there was a push, a government-led push to get more businesses, and we're talking huge businesses, the likes of Unilever, that are producing a lot of food and therefore a lot of packaging, to do something about that. They came up with something along the lines of Recycle 2020, which was this kind of plan to, push it back onto the consumer. And somehow we netted out where we are today, and I think it's been knowledge, but not common knowledge for a while now, that a lot of stuff goes over to Normandy and gets incinerated, whether you've polished it and cleaned it to within an inch of its life or not. But aside from the outlay of time and the kind of onerousness of it, and the fact that you don't have a choice, and it's all kind of, the whole thing just feels kind of foisted on one, it's a real shame, because there's actually a tremendous amount of goodwill around our environment, and none of it is capitalised on. When we think about climate change as is, the only solution is for us all to accidentally become socialists. The only solution is super individual. So it has to be some great institution that deals with it, because it's too big a problem for people to be able to do something on the ground. So we're all there with our tuna tins, but actually we're surrounded by plastic. We're wearing it, we're walking on it, we're sitting on it. I think that the combination of sort of helplessness, it's got to come from government and supranational organisations to actually do something, combined with this idea that you can kind of get indulgences for it, and that comes from the kind of like marketplace around climate and carbon offsets. I just think there's so much wrong with it. Obviously, there's the big topic of the science itself, which I'll park for now. But I think the way we think about it is more to do with the environment. So, for example, floods in Valencia, the most interesting thing for me was, hang on a minute, what happens when you put concrete around the edge of a landmass? What does that mean for the water table? Because the other lines of argument either became very partisan very quickly and quite extreme, or again, they went back to this kind of, who's going to deal with it? Big boys, big faceless boys need to deal with it, and none of the rest of us can do anything. There's no easy answer to a lot of this stuff, but I think it does require a bit of a first principles, back to basics approach, and our tiny contribution to that is just to go, what about the environment? What about litter in the hedgerows? What about people having more information about some of the materials and chemicals that are around them that are probably poisoning them and the environment that they're in? And then we tether that to health as well. So,
what do you think about management consultants coming off the back of that question? Because are they facilitating or creating environments for innovation, radical thinking, which is what they're in theory designed to do? Or do you think they're servicing something else?
Well, I have to say, I fortunately haven't come into contact with a lot of management consultants in life, except personally, but then you sort of just gloss over it, don't you? And that's sort of the end of that. We've talked about bullshit jobs, and I think oftentimes people who are management consultants are very bright, capable people. Certainly all the management consultants I've ever met are very bright, intellectual, capable humans. But again, they are within this paradigm of taking something already enormous and trying to kind of remake a small part of it. You don't get a management consultant coming into a business of 10 people or 100 people. And that's not me necessarily going, well, it would be much better if we were national shopkeepers. But they are a reaction to a hyper-leveraged, because cheap money, environment where we can afford to have a lot of companies that are either zombie companies or are zombie companies that are masquerading as businesses doing really well, and they feed off that. I mean, I won't start ranting about the insurance industry, but which is a personal bugbear, but most management consultants I know work with the insurance industry. You need to have these behemoths to kind of go in and sort of tweet around the edges. It's just so far removed from people who are trying to create something new from scratch. So I that's a very long way of saying that I don't interact a lot with the management consultant world, but I see it as a corollary, as a consequence of this cheap money world that we have, where we've just had decades and decades now in this Keynesian paradigm of misallocation of resources. So people running businesses are making decisions that are informed by changes to the money supply that are not driven by market forces, they're driven by the state.
Last question, because we're running out of time. Is there a case for basis, but from the left?
We don't see basis as being something that needs to sit left or right, and that's really important to me. That I consider myself to be apolitical, and I also feel very strongly that we have reached a point in the current climate where we need to stop being partisan and being kind of binary in how we think about some of these things. When I speak to people who would consider themselves of the left or left-leaning, friends, acquaintances, the sentiments around fixing public services, we can all get behind that. And I think we're getting to a point where all of us are kind of understanding together that the solutions need to be numerous, and we should try multiple ways of recreating the sausage to get there. I think we also think about kind of other things alongside the allocation of capital to companies. whether that's thinking about tracking where people are spending money on services that they're not paying taxes for, which is something we'll be looking to do soon, or whether it's thinking about jobs boards or directories for people who work in the state who maybe are looking to move out, or directories of places you can go, say, for healthcare that is not NHS, just to make that really easy for people. So we're thinking about some of these consumer touch points that take us beyond doing quite an esoteric thing, which is in investing in early stage pre-seed businesses. I think where one sort of comes unstuck with the kind of left-right thing is if someone feels like this stuff must be provided by the state and only the state. That is a discussion. It's a discussion we have to have, because it ain't working. And growth is not government spend. And if the government keeps printing money in order that they can borrow it themselves, that leads to inflation, and inflation is a tax on your money. It turns money into a quasi-service, and that is making people poorer and poorer. And the government is having to do that. The world is big, it is complicated, it is only going to get bigger and more complicated, particularly when we add another planet. And so that system doesn't hold. So we need other solutions. So I haven't to date had a conversation with someone that from any walk of political life where we haven't had a really fruitful conversation about that. Ultimately, some people are individualists and some people are super individualists. But I think the provision of things that improve people's lives should be a universal kind of shooting point for all of us, and a North Star. I think basis isn't here to sort of politicise the changing of public services. It's here to say that actually, if you are someone who relies on these services and has no other option, particularly for most of the population for their entire lives, it's not good enough. We need to do something about it.
Well, on that note, Harriet Green, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And finally, Dominic Cummings delivers a candid and thought-provoking address at the Looking for Growth conference. He talks about pulling back the curtain on Whitehall's dysfunction. Let's hear that address now.
Thank you. So I'm not going to give a speech. Lawrence asked me to do a kind of Q&A on the questions of how does power really work in Whitehall? How does number 10 really work? How does the Prime Minister's authority and office really work? Why does it seem like so much... why there are so many disasters, why it seems like repeatedly we have prime ministers who can't actually grip power. So I'll just talk for 5 minutes, and then we'll just then anyone can ask any questions or make any suggestions they want to. So first problems, then what to do about it. If you look back at the British state in 1800 under Pitt as prime minister, we had a real responsibility of ministers. You had a PM who had real live player meetings, and who was very, very interested in the question of talent, and elite talent was taken incredibly seriously. The system of government looked much more like SpaceX in 2024, 220 years ago, than it does today in Whitehall. Now we have fake responsibility for ministers, and a kind of fake meritocracy, and a way of government which is essentially NPC ministers literally reading out scripts. Government meetings, including cabinet meetings, are now literally entirely scripted. People always think that this is a metaphor when I say it, but it's not a metaphor. It's actually the case. If you have a meeting with the Prime Minister, the conclusions of the meeting with the Prime Minister are written before the meeting starts. They're in a thing called Chairman's Notes. It sounds like Yes Minister, but Yes Minister is a training manual for Westminster. So the talent collapse is obviously massive. You have a huge collapse in elite talent going into the MPs and also going into the civil service. And now you also have the problem that you have a kind of reverse ratchet whereby the best people leave by their 40s, and the worst people get promoted. So when I was there in 2020 during COVID, there were some outstanding, really, really able people, particularly in the Prime Minister's private office, where a lot of the superstar young talent gets put. Pretty much all of those people have left the civil service now, and that is a general phenomenon. What happens is that very smart, very able, dynamic young people, a lot of them are idealistic and they join the civil service at an early age, and then after 10, 15 years, they look around and they look ahead and they see who gets promoted and they see how the senior people spend their time, and they decide they're going to leave. And then the absolute worst dregs of the HR department tend to be the people who are then promoted into senior management. Obviously, almost no one is ever now fired for failure. And they've now kind of instantiated this principle in their appointment of the new Cabinet Secretary. The new Cabinet Secretary, of course, was responsible for the total debacle of preparations for pandemic. He's the person who tried to get me and the Prime Minister to make the national message on COVID that we should all hold, quote, chickenpox parties. That was literally the Permanent Secretary in charge of DHSC who proposed the most insane, much worse than anything Bolsonaro ever did, policy. And the Civil Service's response is to make him Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Office itself, people think, exists to work for the PM, but the Cabinet Office does not see itself as working for the PM. The Cabinet Office sees itself constitutionally as working for itself. It's the Cabinet Secretary who promotes and controls the perm secs and other senior appointments in the system. And it's almost impossible to describe how tightly and how insanely the Cabinet Office runs this process. I'll give you one simple insight into how it works. In September 2020, we realized before it became big news, or really any news, that rapid tests were going to work. Because of the general implosion of the Whitehall system, we got a former commanding officer of the SAS regiment to actually take over organising rapid testing. A brilliant guy. Of course, the Cabinet Office then said that he had to use all the normal HR and all the normal procurement and all the normal everything in terms of building his team. So, of course, the SAS guy says, well, it's going to take me the usual Whitehall period of time, then it's going to take 6-12 months. So even when the Cabinet Office is staring at thousands of people dying in weeks, it will always prioritise maintaining the existing HR, existing financial systems, existing procurement, existing everything. So if that's true, when they know that thousands of people are going to die in a few weeks, they did the same thing on PPE, tried to do the same thing on PPE in the spring. If we listened to them then there would have been no PPE for the NHS in April. So it's important to remember, if they'll do that when they literally know thousands of people are about to die, imagine what it's like now for Labour ministers in any kind of normal time, when they say this is urgent. Now, at the time, the only way around that problem was I had to get the five top officials in the country into the cabinet room and say to them, if the SAS dude doesn't tell me tomorrow morning that this has changed, I'm going to get the Prime Minister to fire all 5 of you immediately. And that was literally the only thing that would actually make them change their behaviour. As the power of Prime Ministers and the grip of Number 10 has failed over the last few decades, the Treasury obviously has taken more and more power, and this also is a disaster. The Treasury and its budget processes essentially vandalised the building of crucial capabilities, and they make any kind of long-term budgeting essentially completely impossible. The Treasury also is completely hopeless at cost control, and as Ben Warner said earlier, is completely hopeless at analysis. So as this part of the government has taken more and more power, then its capacity for vandalising has also spread. So what to do about it? Leave aside the kind of blue skies if you want to completely radically remake the state, pass loads of primary legislation. I'll leave that scenario aside for the moment. Here's a more practical way of approaching it. Number one, the Prime Minister's office has to take actual power for performance management of permanent secretaries and for other senior civil servants. They have to be able, the Prime Minister's office has to be able to say, these are our priorities, and we insist that the civil service actually delivers those priorities. At the moment, there is no process for doing that. What the Prime Minister wakes up every day and says, well, I wish this would happen, has no connection to what senior civil servants think their priorities are, has no connection to their incentives, has no connection to how they're hired or paid or anything else. So the Prime Minister's office has to do that. Secondly, you have to develop a team in the Prime Minister's office that can monitor what you really care about and then intervene and say and insist. The Prime Minister insists that the following people clearly can't do their job and these people have to be therefore replaced. That is completely crucial. And of course, those two things connect, right? The Prime Minister's office taking responsibility for the performance management and then creating this team that can actually insist on changing teams. You have to shift from the current closed caste system where almost everybody promoted to senior positions comes internally, and you have to shift to open by default appointments, so that instead of everything being promoted from inside the system, the default mode for the system shifts to we're going to bring people in from outside. And the fourth thing is we need a Prime Minister who, as William Pitt did, fighting Napoleon in 1800, reminded everyone that he was First Lord of the Treasury, and the Treasury was put in its box. The power of the Treasury needs to be broken up. If you do all four of these things, then you can actually be a number 10 where the government largely controls the government. And it's important to note, all of these things can be done without any primary legislation. A lot of the arguments you see now with Doge and Trump and whatnot, where people are challenging a lot of things in the courts, and there's lots of arguments about can the president really do this, etc. In many, many ways, Trump's powers to control the system are much inferior to British Prime Ministers, which are actually vast in all sorts of ways, both formal and informal. But this, I think, therefore points to, this is the last thing I'll say, points to the heart of the question, right? Starmer could wake up and do these four things tomorrow. We started doing all of these four things in 2020, which is one of the reasons why there was such a huge media backlash, because the system obviously rightly saw these changes as existential to its power. So they briefed the media, this is a fascist takeover, the vote leave people are insane, maniacs, etc., etc. But we started doing this in 2020. You don't need primary legislation to do it. The core of the issue in the British state for decades, really since Thatcher, has been that the key people in number 10 have not wanted actually to govern. They see government largely as theatre. They see it as an NPC phenomenon. The ministers walk up Downing Street, they nod, they smile at the cameras pretend that the cabinet is the meeting that decides things. But the cabinet is complete theatre now. It almost never has any actual power over anything. I didn't even attend cabinet once in 2020, that's how completely irrelevant it was. But the ministers are happy with the system of it being a fake. And the officials, of course, are happy with the system being a fake, because it means that they get on with the true business of actually running the government. So both sides of the system have been happy over the last 30 years or so. And that's why people keep asking a lot of questions about the Tories. The Tory MPs for 14 years didn't want to be live players. They were happy in their NPC role, reading out the bullet point scripts. So that goes to the real question. Unless we find this ultimately has only a political solution. You can come up with plans about how to change how number 10 works. Lots of these problems are not very complicated to sort out. But we have a political class that hasn't wanted to actually govern, and that's just been content to sit there playing its role in this fake theatre, whilst the permanent system drives the economy, the MOD, the intelligence services, all these different parts of the system. Well, it vandalizes capabilities and drives us into this crisis that we've got now. Okay, I'll stop there.
That's all from us this week. If you're not subscribed, you can do so below to never miss an episode. Thank you for joining, and catch you next week.